Have you ever set down something perfectly good in your hands because someone else made theirs look shinier? Have you ever walked away from a weapon that never once failed you, simply because a stranger on the other side of the hill carried one that caught the light differently? There is an old story, told by firelight, passed down through generations, about a hunter who did exactly that. He threw away the one thing that could save his life, chasing the illusion of something better. And he paid for it in front of everyone he ever wanted to impress. This is that story. Elan was, without question, the finest archer in the village. Every elder admitted it, every child whispered it. His bow was made from a single piece of ash wood, carved by his grandfather over 3 long winters, sanded smooth as river stone, strung with sinew so perfectly tensioned that the arrow left it with barely a whisper. It never betrayed him. In the full stretch of a summer, Elan's bow fed his family more times than he could count, filled the storehouse when others came home empty, and earned him a place of quiet respect among the hunters. And yet, and this is the part that matters, Elan was miserable. Every single evening he sat at the edge of the communal fire with his jaw tight and his eyes distant, not resting after the day's labor, but cataloguing everyone else's equipment with the focus of a man preparing for war. He watched the chief's son clean a bow wrapped in polished copper fittings that caught the firelight in a way that made Elan's stomach twist. He noticed when the hunters from the eastern ridge came to trade and carried arrows a full hand-length longer than his own. He spent more energy calculating what everyone else possessed than celebrating what he had already taken down with the weapon in his own grip. One night, his younger sister asked him why he never smiled after a successful hunt. Elan stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because Crowing took down 2 elk this season with that long-range bow of his," he said, "and everything I bring home feels smaller next to that." His sister looked at the full drying rack behind him, then back at her brother, and said nothing. There was nothing useful left to say. Elan had decided his bow was inadequate, and a decision like that, once made, is almost impossible to walk back. He began calling his grandfather's bow trash, quietly at first, then aloud when he thought no one could hear. He resented the weight of it. He resented the sound of it. He resented the way it fit his hand as naturally as breathing, because somehow that familiarity had become proof of limitation rather than proof of mastery. It started as a half-sentence overheard at the trading post. An old man from the northern cliffs muttering to his companion about a canyon 2 days' walk to the west, where the walls were so close and so tall that sound moved through them in strange ways. Strange enough, the old man said, that if a person entered with the right kind of longing in their heart, the mountain spirit who lived in the echoes would take notice. Elan was not even certain the old man was speaking to him, but he heard the words shadow bow, and his entire body went still. He pressed himself against the post wall and listened. The legend, as the old man told it in fragments, was this. Somewhere deep in the echoing canyon, there existed a bow that had no fixed form. It was not made of wood or bone or horn. It was made of want. It observed whatever weapon a person most envied and immediately became that weapon. Same length, same draw weight, same appearance, all of it reproduced instantly and completely. The story said a hunter who carried the shadow bow would never again need to look at another man's equipment with anything other than calm, because his own bow would always match or exceed whatever he desired. Elan walked home from the trading post with his heart hammering against his ribs. He barely slept. By the second morning, he had convinced himself the legend was not a legend at all, but a report, probably accurate, waiting to be acted upon. He went to the river at dawn, looked at his grandfather's bow for a long time, and then, with the determination of a man who has already decided and is simply carrying out the motion, he dropped it into the current and watched it disappear around the bend. He felt a brief, cold shock in his chest as it vanished, the kind a person feels when they have just done something they cannot undo. But he pushed it down and turned west toward the canyon. He was certain he was walking towards something better. That certainty, as it turned out, was precisely the problem. The canyon was everything the old man's muttering had suggested, and nothing Elan was prepared for. The walls rose so high on either side that the strip of sky above looked like a pale ribbon pinned between two mountains. Sound did not behave here the way it behaved in the open forest. A pebble knocked loose from above would click against the rock face 3 times over before the first echo finished. And by the time the whole sequence completed, it sounded less like a pebble and more like a conversation. Elan stood at the canyon's heart and announced his purpose out loud, feeling slightly foolish, but committed. He said he had come for the shadow bow. He said he was the best archer in his village and deserved a weapon worthy of that status. The canyon was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make him wonder if he had been wrong about everything. Then the walls answered. It was not a voice exactly, more the sensation of one, the way the whole canyon seemed to lean forward and concentrate its attention on him. The presence that gathered in that sound was old in the way that mountains are old, patient in the way that only something which has watched centuries of human foolishness can be patient. The spirit of the great mountain did not lecture. It asked a single question. What had Elan done with his own bow? Elan explained he had released it into the river to make room for something better. The canyon was quiet again for a moment, and in that quiet there was something that felt very much like a sigh. Then a shape materialized in the mist that curled along the canyon floor, dark as shadow, faintly luminous at the curves, a bow unlike anything Elan had ever held. The spirit spoke. This bow will instantly become the equal of any weapon you envy. Whatever you see in another hunter's hands that you desire, this bow will mirror it completely. Elan reached for it. The spirit added one more sentence in the same calm, unhurried tone. But understand that a copied weapon carries only the shape of another man's skill, not the skill itself. The hand that fires the arrow matters more than the wood that releases it. Elan was already cradling the shadow bow and barely registered the warning. He walked out of the canyon with his chin up and his chest full of the specific satisfaction of a man who believes he has finally gotten what he deserved. The first morning back in the hunting grounds should have been a triumph. Instead, it became something Elan would spend a long time trying not to think about. He entered the eastern forest at first light, shadow bow in hand, moving quietly through the undergrowth the way a good hunter does, or at least the way he used to, before his attention began fracturing. He spotted a deer at a promising distance and raised the bow, but before he could draw, he noticed another hunter 200 paces north using a longbow with a heavy draw that could send an arrow through a full-grown elk at distances that made Elan's jaw tighten. He thought very clearly, I want that. The shadow bow reacted before he finished the thought. It stretched in his hands with a sensation like wet leather being pulled taut, growing heavier and longer in the span of 3 heartbeats. The deer startled at his sudden movement and vanished into the trees. Elan adjusted his grip on the new configuration and told himself that was fine. There would be other opportunities. He walked on. 20 minutes later, he watched a young hunter from the southern camp move through a thicket with a short, fast recurve bow that allowed him to pivot and aim in tight spaces with fluid ease. Again, the thought arrived, I want that instead. The shadow bow contracted. It shed length and mass and settled into a compact shape that sat differently in his palm. He raised it toward a pair of rabbits, but by then he had spotted a third hunter in the middle distance, using a bow with a particular cant to the grip that looked efficient in a way he could not immediately explain, and the thought arrived again before he could stop it. and the bow began changing again before he had fired a single arrow. This continued through the entire morning. Each new hunter he encountered triggered a new desire, which triggered a new transformation, which disrupted whatever shot he had been setting up. By midday, Elan had walked 12 miles, watched the bow cycle through 9 distinct configurations, and taken exactly nothing. He sat on a log and held the shadow bow in both hands and looked at it with an expression that was starting to resemble the look his sister had given him at the campfire, the one that said there was nothing useful left to say. The winter festival hunt was the most important event the village held all year. It was not a competition exactly. The elders would not have called it that. But everyone understood that the hunter who brought down the prize elk fed his family through the worst of the cold season with honor attached to every meal. Every able hunter assembled at the meadow's edge before sunrise, 23 of them standing in a loose line in the pre-dawn dark, breath fogging in the cold air. Each one quiet with the particular stillness of a person who is genuinely ready. Elan took his place in the line and felt, for a moment, the warm pulse of confidence he used to carry into every hunt, before the envy had taken up permanent residence in his chest. He was still a skilled hunter. His hands still knew the motions. The shadow bow still had the capacity to become whatever he needed. The meadow lightened slowly. Then the great elk stepped out of the tree line on the far side of the clearing, a bull of exceptional size, moving with the unhurried authority of an animal that has never had much reason to fear. And the entire line of hunters went absolutely still. This was the moment. Elan raised the shadow bow and began his draw. And then his eyes, which had always been his greatest gift as a hunter, betrayed him completely. They did not stay on the elk. They moved to the hunter on his left, whose bow looked different than it had last week, maybe heavier, maybe more accurate. They moved to the right, where someone was drawing with a smoothness that suggested a bow with a particularly clean release. They moved again, further down the line, cataloguing, comparing, measuring, calculating. And with every measurement, the thought arrived, and with every thought, the shadow bow shifted, a small tremor running through the wood each time, as if the bow itself was growing exhausted by the demand. What happened next was witnessed by every hunter in the line, and it was discussed around campfires for years afterward, though usually with a mixture of sympathy and the particular kind of laughter that people use when something is both genuinely funny and genuinely sad at the same time. Elan's mind, in the span of perhaps 15 seconds, tried to want 10 different bows simultaneously. He saw the heavy long bow and wanted it. He saw the short recurve and wanted that instead. He saw the canted grip and the narrow limbs and the wide limbs and the different styles of nocking and the variations in string material, and he wanted all of them at once. Because envy, when it has been fed consistently for long enough, stops being selective and simply becomes a reflex that fires at everything it sees. The shadow bow attempted to comply. It stretched and compressed. It tried to be heavy and light at the same time. The limbs bowed outward and then pulled inward. The grip thickened and then thinned. The string went slack and then overcorrected to a tension that made the wood groan. Elan was still holding a full draw when the bow made its final attempt to reconcile 11 contradictory desires at once, and the sound it produced at the moment of failure was not the clean release of an arrow finding its target. It was something considerably louder and more personal. The shadow bow detonated. There is no gentler word for it. It came apart in every direction at the same moment, and the string, on its way to becoming nothing, found Elan's face with precise and unhesitating accuracy. He sat down hard in the meadow grass, both hands over his nose, eyes watering, surrounded by fragments of shadow wood that were already dissolving into the morning mist as if they had never been anything solid to begin with. The elk, reasonably startled by the commotion, had taken 3 bounding steps toward the trees. It paused there at the edge, because elk are curious animals, and also because the noise had come from only one direction. The 22 remaining hunters had not moved. They had remained exactly where they were, bows drawn, eyes on the target, attention undivided. In the silence that followed Elan's catastrophe, the line held steady. Then, without discussion or signal, because none was needed, the hunters released together. The elk went down cleanly at the meadow's edge, and the sound that followed was not dramatic, just the ordinary, dignified sound of a successful hunt concluding the way a successful hunt should. There was no cheering, exactly. There was the quiet satisfaction of people who had done the thing they came to do without being distracted from it, which is its own kind of celebration. They moved toward the elk with the purposeful coordination of a group that had focused on one thing and hit it. Elan sat in the grass and watched them go. He watched them hoist the elk with practiced efficiency, divide the labor without argument, and begin the walk back toward the village with the confidence of people who would eat well this winter. Not one of them turned back to look at him. It was not cruelty. They simply had no reason to look back, because the hunt was done, and everything they needed was in front of them. Elan sat alone in the meadow for a long time after they disappeared into the tree line. Around him, the last fragments of the shadow bow had dissolved entirely. He held his empty hands in his lap and looked at them, and then looked at the place where his grandfather's bow had always rested, and the full weight of what he had thrown into the river arrived all at once and sat on his chest like a stone. Grandpa Nasuba paused there, letting the fire crackle once into the silence. He looked around at the faces on the other side of the flame, taking his time the way old men do when they have earned the right to take their time. "Now," he said, "before any of you start feeling too sorry for Elan, I want you to understand something. His bow was not magic. His grandfather's bow was not magic either. The ash wood and the sinew were tools, nothing more. What made Elan the best archer in the village was not the equipment. It was the 10,000 arrows he had fired until the motion lived in his hands without having to pass through his brain first. It was the trust. He trusted that bow, and so his body could relax into the shot instead of tensing around uncertainty. The moment he started watching other people's bows instead of his own arrow's path, the trust broke. And a hunter without trust in his own hands is just a person standing in a field holding wood." He leaned back and looked up at the stars for a moment. Elan eventually carved himself a new bow. Took him most of the winter. It was never quite as good as his grandfather's. How could it be? But it was his, shaped by his own hands, earned back slowly. And he stopped looking at other hunters' equipment, not because he became enlightened exactly, but because he remembered what it felt like to sit in an empty meadow while everyone else walked home with the elk. Grandpa Nasuba smiled, slow and warm, and with just enough edge in it to make the expression interesting. "We are all Elan," he said. "Every one of us. We scroll through other people's lives the way Elan watched other hunters in that meadow, cataloging their bows, their arrows, their catches, their everything. And while we are busy calculating what everyone else has, our own hands forget what they know how to do. We build ourselves a shadow bow out of comparison and envy and the desperate need to have what someone else is carrying. And then we stand in our own meadow at the most important moment of the year and wonder why the thing falls apart in our hands." He prodded the fire once and let the pause breathe. "Your bow is enough. Your hands are enough. The only thing that was ever in your way was looking sideways at someone else's." Moral of the story: The tool you carry is only as powerful as the focus you bring to it. Envy does not sharpen your aim, it fractures it. The hunter who trusts what is already in his hands will always outlast the one who spends his days chasing the illusion of a better weapon. What you have, fully mastered, will always outperform what you wish you had, half understood. If this story made you think of something you have been neglecting in favor of watching what everyone else is carrying, like this channel, maybe, press subscribe so the next story finds you before the next festival hunt does. We will be here by the fire.
By the time this story ends, you'll already be fast asleep.